Welcome back to Grant Bakes. Today we're making the cinnamon raisin sourdough country loaf. It's absolutely packed with juicy raisins, warm cinnamon, and no added sugar. Here's how to make it. To a mixing bowl, start by adding 325 grams of water. This is going to be a 75% hydration sourdough bread. If you care about those kind of things, if not, don't worry about it. Next, add 10 grams of salt. I'm using kosher salt, but you can use sea salt or any plain salt that you have. Then 100 grams of active Raisin sourdough starter. This one I fed the night before and now it's ready in the morning. 100 grams goes into the bowl, and then whatever is left in the jar, put it back in your fridge, and you can use that to feed your starter for your next loaf of bread the next time you bake. Stir everything to dissolve the starter and salt into the liquid, and then add 425 grams of plain white bread flour. And I'm going to add an additional 25 grams of whole grain rye flour. This gives a good nutty flavor that I think goes really well with raisins and cinnamon, but you can use a full 450 grams of bread flour if you don't want to include any whole grain in this. That's completely fine too. But I do love the touch of nuttiness that the rye flour adds. Now mix everything together completely and thoroughly until there aren't any dry bits of flour remaining. This is the part when you're just bringing the dough together with your hands or with a spoon until it looks something like this, shaggy but no dry bits of flour left. Cover up the dough at this point and let it rest for 30 minutes at room temperature on your counter. That's going to allow the dough to hold together really well. 30 minutes later, your dough is ready for the first set of stretch and folds. We're going to be performing 3.5 sets of stretch and folds. You'll see why we're doing a half in just a minute. And we're going to be doing most of the stretch and folds inside of a bowl. I have this glass bowl that I've just greased with a little bit of olive oil so that the dough doesn't stick as much. With your dough transferred into an oiled bowl, go ahead and start the stretch and fold process. Just stretch the dough, a corner of the dough up into the air and fold it over the top of the dough. Grab the next edge, stretch it up, and fold it over. Keep going around the bowl about 6 to 10 times. It really depends on the dough. I usually just keep stretching and folding until I feel the dough start to be a little bit more tense and to resist the stretching and folding process. Once it starts to resist, I know the gluten is developing, and I stop and cover up the bowl and let it rest for another 30 minutes. So just let your dough rest here on your kitchen counter for a half hour. 30 minutes later, it's time for stretch and fold number 2 and to start incorporating the cinnamon and raisins. We've got 5 grams of cinnamon, or about 1 teaspoon, and then 100 grams of plain raisins. They haven't been soaked in anything, just plain store-bought raisins. We're going to add half of the cinnamon and raisins now, and then the other half later. So sprinkle half of the cinnamon on top of the dough right now, and then half of the amount of raisins, so about 50 grams of the raisins, goes right on top of the cinnamon. Then with slightly damp hands, start pressing the raisins down into the dough. Since you're going to be stretching and folding the dough to incorporate the cinnamon and raisins, this pressing down will just allow the raisins to stick to the dough so they don't fall everywhere when you're stretching and folding. This will be almost exactly the same as the first set of stretch and folds, but you're only going to be stretching and folding 4 times. So lift the first edge up into the air and fold it over the top of the dough. Then grab the next edge, stretch it up, and fold it over the top of the dough as well. Go around 4 times doing the same thing. I really like this stretching and folding process to incorporate other things like fruit and nuts and cheese into dough. I've shown it in a video before. I like how easy this method is, and since I almost always use stretch and folds anyway when I'm making sourdough bread, this is a great way to incorporate things into my dough while following my standard basic process. So after you've done 4 stretches and folds, go ahead and cover up the dough again and let it rest at room temperature for a half hour. You'll add the rest of these guys in just a little bit. 30 minutes later, time for stretch and fold number 3. So uncover the dough and add the rest of the cinnamon right on top, followed by the rest of the raisins. Then with slightly damp hands again, go ahead and press the raisins and cinnamon into the dough just to get everything to stick, and then you can start the third set of stretches and folds. You're going to do 4 individual folds again this time, stretching up and over the dough, incorporating layer after layer of cinnamon and raisins throughout this dough as you do. Once you've completed all of the stretches and folds, cover up the dough again and let it rest at room temperature for a half hour. This rest period will allow the dough to relax and will help the raisins to stay put inside the dough. Okay, it's been 30 minutes, and I told you we'd be doing a half set of stretch and folds. This is what I mean by that. Take the dough out of the bowl and put it on a clean part of your counter, no flour necessary. Then flip it over so that the smooth side is on top and the side with all the seams is against the counter. Then go around the dough like this, cupping and pulling the dough. This creates tension across the top of the dough and pushes the edges of the dough underneath. This is sort of a less intense way of stretching and folding that you're able to do once the gluten in the dough has been sufficiently developed like this. Now you can see those raisins almost popping through the top of the dough. Place the dough back into the glass bowl, Cover it up one last time, and you're going to let it rest and rise at room temperature on your counter for 3 to 6 hours, as long as it takes for the dough to double in size like this. For me, that took 4 hours, but it might take more time or less time depending on the temperature of your kitchen. Now it's time to pre-shape the dough. This simply means you're going to shape the dough into a ball on the counter before you actually shape it into a loaf shape later. So take the dough onto the counter, no flour necessary. Do the cupping and pulling motion again, creating tension across the top of the dough and gently pulling the corners of the dough underneath. Let the dough rest uncovered on your counter for about 30 minutes. That's going to allow the dough to rest and relax and be easier to shape later. Now for the final shape, put some rice flour into your banneton basket. You can use whole flour if you want to as well. Then put a little bit of bread flour on top of the dough. That's going to create a non-stick barrier. Flip it over on the counter so the floured side is down and the sticky side is up. Then gently pull the dough into a square shape like this. Once you've got a square like this, take one side of the dough and fold it over into the center, pressing down into the middle. Then take the other side and fold it over into the center as well, pressing down in the middle where the two ends meet. Then take the edge of the dough that's farthest away from you and you're going to roll it towards yourself, tucking and rolling, tucking and rolling, tucking the dough into itself and then rolling it towards you again until you've got a log of dough that looks something like this. To fix these swirly edges, I like to take the flap of the dough on the side, pull it out, and fold it under the loaf. Then I do the same thing with the other side, pulling it out and folding it under, and that creates two clean sides of this oval-shaped loaf. There are plenty of ways to shape a batard. This is just the way I like to do it. Flip the dough over so the seam side is facing up and place it into the banneton basket. Now you can move the dough directly to the fridge to start a long overnight cold proof. That's what I've done in a lot of my videos and recipes, but what I'm actually going to do is cover the dough up and let it rest and rise on the counter for 1 hour before I move it into the fridge. After that hour rest, it's a little bit puffier, and I know it's got a head start on fermentation, so it won't be very likely to underproof. At this point, I move the dough to the fridge for an overnight cold proof. I recommend about 8 to 12 hours in the fridge. Then the next day, 30 minutes before you're ready to bake, preheat your oven to 500 degrees Fahrenheit with your Dutch oven inside for at least 30 minutes. Then with your oven preheated, take your dough out of the fridge. It probably won't have increased too much in size overnight since it's been in the cold fridge, but it still should feel puffy and well proofed. Now take a sheet of parchment paper that's a little bit bigger than your dough and flip the dough out so it's seam side down onto the parchment paper. Brush off any excess rice flour or whole grain flour that's on top of the dough, and now you're ready to score. So get out a razor blade or your favorite bread lame, and I'm just going to score one straight line down the center of this dough. This is a little bit different than what I normally do to get an ear, but this will allow the dough to just open up in a nice, natural, even way right on top in the center of the loaf. So with the dough scored, pick it up, parchment paper and all, and transfer it into your hot Dutch oven, whichever kind of Dutch oven you're using. Place it onto the hot surface, cover it up to trap the steam with that lid, and then bake this at 500 degrees Fahrenheit for 20 minutes with the lid on. 20 minutes later, take the lid of the Dutch oven off to reveal the oven spring on your loaf. This loaf is bursting out with raisins, and the smell of warm cinnamon is just filling the house right now. If you love the smell of cinnamon, you need to bake this loaf of bread, if for nothing else than just for the smell. Keep baking this for 15 minutes with the lid off. That'll give the top a nice brown color. Then transfer the baked loaf of bread onto a wire rack. Allow it to rest and cool for at least 1 hour before you slice into it. One problem you might run into with this recipe is that the raisins on top of the loaf that burst out while it's baking tend to get so charred that you wouldn't want to eat them. I honestly just pick off these sacrificial raisins and throw them away. I consider it the cost of doing business when making this bread. Some people say that if you soak the raisins in liquid before you add them to the dough, that'll keep them from burning and singeing. I don't find that to be the case. I find that they still get burnt even if I soak them. So I'm fine picking off a few sacrificial raisins after baking the loaf. But you can soak and drain your raisins before using them if you want to give that method a try too. I think this recipe has the perfect amount of raisins. There's a raisin in almost every single bite of bread you get, but at the same time it's not overloaded with raisins. It's just perfect. The raisins are plump and juicy inside of this bread, and the cinnamon provides a warmth and the feeling of sweetness without any added sugar. It's like a grown-up cinnamon raisin bread. As you can see, this loaf is crusty and crunchy on the outside, but still soft and fluffy on the inside. A slice of this is perfect with butter, but I also enjoy it plain. I was just tearing off chunks of this bread and eating it. To be honest, I ate about half of the loaf in one sitting. You know, that's the good thing about homemade sourdough bread. You can feel good about the bread that you're just demolishing. Even with such a straightforward process, without soaking the raisins in any kind of liquid, they still ended up plump and juicy, and I would even say succulent. If you're a cinnamon raisin fan, this recipe is a must try. Go ahead and look for the ingredients in the description of this video, and I'll see you in the next one.